The Endeavour glided silently through the abyss of deep space, its sleek hull reflecting the faint glow of a dying star. Inside, the hum of the ship's engines and the occasional chirp of monitoring equipment were the only sounds. The crew was a small, close-knit team, 6 men and women, hand-picked for their skills and their resilience to the isolation of long-term space travel. For months, the mission had been uneventful. Just another survey expedition cataloging anomalies in the outer reaches of the galaxy. Until now. "Captain, I'm picking up something," said Lieutenant Mira Havel, her voice tight with both excitement and confusion. Her station lit up with flickering streams of data. She leaned closer to her console, brushing dark curls away from her face as she scrutinized the readings. "What kind of something?" Captain Elias Morales asked, rising from his chair. His presence was steady and commanding, the result of years in command. He joined her at the terminal. "It's a signal, but not like any we've encountered before," Mira replied. "Repeating, structured, but the frequency is—" She trailed off, her fingers dancing across the console. The data resolved into a pattern. "It's not natural, and it's coming from a derelict vessel orbiting that star." The bridge fell silent as the crew absorbed her words. A derelict ship, alien, the first truly significant find in years of uneventful missions. The implications were staggering. "Bring us closer," Morales ordered. "Dr. Shaw, prep the lab. Marcos, ready a team for a boarding operation." "On it," said Marcos Delaney, the ship's engineer. His voice carried a mix of bravado and nerves. He turned to leave, but not before muttering, "Hope it's not another false alarm." The Endeavour approached cautiously, maneuvering through the weak gravitational pull of the dying star. The alien vessel emerged from the shadows, a hulking, fractured mass of metal and organic growths. It was unlike anything the crew had seen before. The ship seemed to pulse faintly, illuminated by patches of bioluminescent moss that clung to its battered hull. Scorch marks and breaches in its exterior told a story of violence and abandonment. "God," whispered Aaron Shaw, the ship's biologist, as the vessel filled the viewports. "How long has it been out here?" "Centuries, maybe millennia," replied Morales. "But the signal is active. Something's alive, or at least functional." As the Endeavour docked with the alien craft, the crew's tension grew palpable. The airlock hissed open, and the boarding team, Marcos, Dr. Shaw, and 2 others, stepped into the unknown. The corridor was dim and suffused with a strange, sourceless light. The walls were covered in organic tendrils, some pulsing faintly as though alive. The air was heavy, carrying an almost metallic tang. "Stay close," Marcos said, his voice uncharacteristically subdued. They moved deeper into the ship, scanning the environment and marking their path. The atmosphere felt wrong. Too still, too heavy, as if the air itself resisted their presence. In the central chamber, they found it. The cocoon. It was suspended in the middle of the room, encased in a translucent membrane that shimmered faintly under their lights. Roughly human-sized but grotesquely deformed, the thing inside was impossible to fully comprehend. Its limbs were misshapen, bending at odd angles, and its face was an incomplete mimicry of a human's. Features half-formed, as though sculpted by an unskilled hand. Dr. Shaw knelt to examine it, her scanner emitting soft beeps as she collected data. "It's alive," she said, her voice tight with disbelief. "Barely. Its metabolism is slowed to almost nothing, like it's in stasis." Marcos stepped closer, frowning. "It's trying to look human," he said. "But why?" No one had an answer. Shaw touched the surface of the cocoon. It was warm. The creature inside stirred faintly, its deformed mouth twitching as though attempting speech. "Captain, we need to get this back to the lab," Shaw said into her comm. "This is extraordinary. It's some kind of biological experiment. Or a survivor." "You're sure it's safe to move?" Morales asked. "Safe might be a stretch, but this is the find of a lifetime. We can't leave it here." Reluctantly, Morales agreed. The team worked quickly to detach the cocoon from its restraints, its pulsating surface filling the room with an eerie glow. As they carried it back to the Endeavor, a faint sound echoed through the alien ship, a whispering noise like a soft wind brushing against hollow metal. It followed them, growing louder as they approached their ship. "Do you hear that?" one of the crewmates asked, his voice shaking. "Just the air cycling through," Marcos said quickly, but his face betrayed his unease. Once aboard the Endeavor, the cocoon was secured in the lab. The strange whispering ceased as the airlock sealed, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Shaw began running tests, her excitement barely contained. The rest of the crew gathered on the bridge, staring at the alien vessel drifting on their monitors. "Something about this doesn't sit right," Morales said finally. "Marcos, make sure the containment protocols are airtight. I don't want that thing causing trouble." Marcos nodded, though his usual swagger was absent. "You got it, Captain." As the crew settled into their routines, the alien ship suddenly powered down, its bioluminescence fading into darkness. The signal they had been tracking went silent. "It's like it's dead," Mira said, glancing at Morales, "or it's done with us." On board the Endeavor, the cocoon began to stir. Subtle at first, a faint twitch, a shiver beneath the membrane. Then came the whispering, this time clearer, louder, and unmistakably directed at the ship's crew. And this time it wasn't just the air. The Endeavor's lab was an island of harsh light in the ship's dim interior. Dr. Aaron Shaw had spent hours examining the cocoon since its retrieval. The creature inside, though still dormant, seemed unnervingly aware of its surroundings. The soft whispering noises it emitted earlier had subsided, but there was an undeniable presence about it, like a predator patiently watching from the shadows. "It's stable," Shaw said aloud, though no one was present to hear. She recorded her notes on a handheld device, glancing occasionally at the scanner readouts. Metabolic activity is increasing slowly, but it's still in a suspended state. Genetic analysis suggests a mix of alien DNA and something resembling early human strands, impossible levels of similarity. The creature stirred faintly, its limbs flexing beneath the translucent membrane. Shaw froze, her eyes locked on the cocoon as its surface quivered. "Captain Morales," she said, activating the comm link on her wrist, "you'd better get down here." The crew gathered in the lab, each person tense and subdued. Captain Morales stood near Shaw, his expression unreadable. Mira Havel hovered by the door, her gaze flitting nervously between the cocoon and the captain. Marcos leaned casually against the wall, though his crossed arms and clenched jaw betrayed his unease. Rounding out the group was Jason Lee, the ship's medic, who kept a cautious distance from the alien artifact. "What's happening?" Morales asked, his voice low. "It's waking up," Shaw said, gesturing to the monitors. The creature's vitals, previously flatlined, now showed erratic spikes. This isn't just a dormant life form, it's responding to the environment, temperature, air composition, even our presence. It's adapting. Before Morales could reply, the cocoon convulsed violently. A sharp, wet, tearing sound filled the lab as the membrane split open, spilling a viscous, milky fluid onto the floor. The crew recoiled, but Shaw remained rooted in place, her fascination overriding her fear. The creature unfolded itself slowly, grotesquely. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending at unnatural angles as it emerged from the cocoon. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, revealing a web of pulsing blue veins. Its face, if it could be called that, was an unsettling approximation of a human visage. Two oversized eyes blinked slowly, their pupils dilating unnaturally. Its mouth hung slightly open, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. It resembled a child's crude drawing of a person brought to horrifying life. The creature turned its head toward the crew, moving with a jerky, almost mechanical rhythm. Then it spoke. "Man," it said, the word broken and guttural, as though dragged from the depths of its throat. The crew froze. The voice was low and raspy, a grating imitation of human speech. Shaw stepped forward cautiously, ignoring Morales's whispered warning to stay back. "Can you understand us?" Shaw asked, her voice trembling despite her attempt at calm. The creature's head twitched sharply, its two large eyes locking onto hers. "Who, man?" it repeated, the word more distinct this time. "No, you." The room seemed to shrink under the weight of its gaze. Shaw struggled to form a response, but the creature spoke again. "I, Ishra," it said, the name rolling unnaturally off its twisted tongue. "Last. Last of what?" Morales asked, stepping forward, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Ishra's gaze shifted to him. "Last of me. My kind. Gone." It tilted its head, its expression, a bizarre mixture of curiosity and hunger, unnerving them all. Shaw's analytical instincts kicked in. "You're the last of your species. What happened to the others?" "Died," Ishra said simply, then paused. "Changed. We tried." "Tried what?" Morales demanded. "To live. To be human." Its body shuddered as it spoke, a grotesque ripple passing through its skin. "To survive." The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Morales stepped closer to Shaw, lowering his voice. "We need to figure out how dangerous this thing is. Keep it talking." Shaw nodded, turning back to Ishra. "How did you find out about humans?" Ishra's eyes narrowed slightly, a gesture that seemed practiced rather than natural. "No. Always no. You. Resilient. Perfect." "Perfect?" Marcos muttered. "That's a stretch." Ishra ignored him. "We made, tried, failed, many times." Shaw felt a chill creep down her spine. The creature's words suggested more than mere observation. You experimented? On yourselves? Ishra's head twitched violently, its expression momentarily distorted into something primal, predatory. Then it relaxed, and its features settled back into their unsettling mimicry of a human face. Yes, we lost much. Its gaze swept over the crew, lingering on each person in turn. You help. Help with what? Morales asked warily. Fix. Complete. Be. You. Before anyone could respond, Ishra staggered forward, its limbs bending unnaturally as it struggled to stay upright. The milky fluid from its cocoon still clung to its skin, dripping onto the floor with a sickening plop. Its body convulsed again, and the lab filled with the wet sound of flesh tearing and reshaping. "Shaw," Morales barked. "What's happening to it?" "I don't know," she said, frantically scanning the creature with her handheld device. Its DNA is rewriting itself. It's adapting to us." The creature let out a guttural noise, halfway between a groan and a scream. When it finally stilled, it stood straighter, its body more balanced. Its face had changed subtly, its features now disturbingly closer to human, though still unsettlingly alien. It opened its mouth to speak, but instead of words, a series of wet, clicking noises emerged. Shaw felt a deep, instinctual dread. "Captain, I think it's learning. Rapidly." "That's enough," Morales said, drawing his pistol. "We're locking this thing down. Shaw, get it contained." But before anyone could move, Ishra spoke again, its voice smoother now, almost soothing. "No fear. Help you. Share. Knowledge." "Knowledge of what?" Shaw asked cautiously. Ishra smiled, a grotesque parody of a human expression. "Life. Power. You want." The crew stared, torn between fear and the allure of the alien's promise. But as Ishra took another step forward, its body shuddered violently, and something dark and slimy sloughed off its back, splattering onto the floor. Beneath the discarded flesh, more human-like features began to emerge, as if it were shedding layers to become one of them. Shaw whispered to Morales, her voice tight with dread. "It's not just mimicking us, it's becoming us." Morales's grip on his pistol tightened. "Not if I can help it." The Endeavor groaned softly as it drifted through the endless void, the sound of its engines a low, throbbing pulse that seemed to echo through the crew's bones. Dr. Aaron Shaw rubbed her eyes, the flicker of the monitors casting a cold light on her pale face. The containment cell was silent, but the weight of Ishra's presence pressed against her. Even with the reinforced glass between them, she felt exposed. Ishra stood in the cell, its grotesque body eerily still. The transformation was undeniable. Where once its skin had been pale and membranous, it now resembled human flesh. Its joints, which had bent in unnatural directions, had straightened. The face that stared back at her from the other side of the glass wasn't quite human, but it was close enough to make her stomach churn. "It's becoming us," she whispered to no one. Her voice trembled. "Not mimicking, becoming." She scrolled through the latest scans. The creature was adapting at a cellular level, integrating human DNA into its own structure. The genetic material it had collected, from discarded hair, skin flakes, even the crew's exhaled breath, had been absorbed and rewritten into its biology. Every test confirmed the horrifying truth. Ishra wasn't just copying their appearance, it was consuming their essence. Her calm crackled to life, startling her. "Shaw, report," came Captain Morales' voice. He sounded tense, more so than usual. She pressed the button to respond. "Its transformation is accelerating. The more it's exposed to us, the more refined it becomes." "How refined?" Morales' tone carried an edge of fear. Shaw hesitated. "It's indistinguishable from a human in certain aspects, but it's not stopping there. Its biology is far more advanced than ours. It's adapting to weaknesses in our DNA, repairing flaws, becoming more." There was silence on the other end of the comm, then Morales' grim reply. "I need you on the bridge. Now." Shaw glanced at Ishra one last time before leaving the lab. Its eyes followed her, unblinking. The crew gathered on the bridge, the tension suffocating. Marcos stood with his arms crossed, his usually cocky demeanor replaced by nervous agitation. Mira sat at her station, her fingers tapping against the console in a restless rhythm. Morales stood at the center, his broad shoulders rigid. "We've got a problem," Morales said, addressing them all. "There've been incidents." "Incidents?" Shaw asked, frowning. "What kind?" Marcos's jaw tightened. "Jason, he's locked himself in his quarters. Says something's wrong with him." "What do you mean, wrong?" Shaw's voice rose slightly. She hated how small the room suddenly felt. Morales gestured to Mira, who pulled up a feed from the ship's surveillance cameras. The grainy footage showed Jason in his quarters, pacing erratically. His skin glistened with sweat, and he kept clawing at his arms, leaving raw red streaks. "He's been complaining of sensations under his skin," Morales said quietly. "He thinks something is growing inside him." "That's impossible," Shaw said, but her voice lacked conviction. She thought of the samples she had taken from Ishra, the way its cells had bonded seamlessly with human tissue in her simulations. The screen flickered as Jason stopped pacing and turned to face the camera. His eyes were bloodshot, his expression wild. He opened his mouth and something moved beneath the skin of his neck. A rippling, unnatural motion that made Shaw's stomach churn. "Kill it," Jason hissed at the camera. His voice was raw, desperate. "Whatever it is, kill it before it—" The feed cut out, plunging the room into silence. Marcos swore under his breath, and Mira stared at the dark screen, her face pale. "Shaw," Morales said, his voice low. "What's happening to him?" Shaw swallowed hard. I don't know. Ishra's biology is invasive, but I didn't think it could." She stopped herself, unwilling to finish the thought. Marcos slammed a fist on the console. "Didn't think it could what? Spread? Infect us?" "I don't know," Shaw snapped. "But if Jason's reacting this way, we're all at risk. We've all been exposed." "Exposed to what?" Mira asked, her voice trembling. "It's in containment. It hasn't touched us." Shaw hesitated, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "It doesn't need to touch us. It's airborne. Microscopic fragments. It's cells. They're in the air." Morales cursed under his breath. "So it's using us to... what? Reproduce?" "No," Shaw said slowly, her voice hollow. to perfect itself. The whispering started again that night. It wasn't the faint, distant sound they'd heard when they first brought Ishra aboard. Now it was louder, clearer, and undeniably intentional. It came through the ship's comm system, the ventilation shafts, even the walls. "I can help you," the voice murmured. "Let me fix you." Shaw lay awake in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. Her heart pounded as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands over her ears, but the voice was inside her mind now. "Let me in." She bolted upright, gasping for air. Her skin prickled as though 1,000 tiny insects were crawling over it. She glanced down and froze. Just beneath the surface of her forearm, something moved, a slow, sinuous ripple. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking. "No, no, no." She stumbled out of her quarters, nearly colliding with Marcos in the corridor. He looked as bad as she felt, his face pale, his eyes sunken. He opened his mouth to speak, but then grimaced, clutching his stomach. "It's inside me," he choked out. Shaw grabbed his arm, her fear momentarily overridden by urgency. "We need to isolate ourselves. Now." But before they could move, the whispering returned, louder than ever. It was no longer a faint murmur. It was Ishra's voice, speaking with perfect clarity. "You can't fight it," it said, its tone almost gentle. "I am the future, and so are you." In the lab, Ishra stood before the glass of its containment cell, staring into the empty room as if it could see them through the ship. Its lips curled into a smile, an almost human expression, but not quite. The glass between it and the rest of the ship began to fog, faint impressions of its hands appearing on the other side, as if pressing against reality itself. And then, with a soft crack, the glass began to splinter. The Endeavor was silent, save for the soft hum of its failing systems. Lights flickered sporadically in the corridors, casting fleeting shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. The air was thick, heavy with the metallic tang of sweat, blood, and something far older, something alien. Dr. Aaron Shaw crouched in the maintenance crawl space, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The wound on her side throbbed with a deep, pulsing pain, the torn flesh glistening with the faint, unnatural sheen of something spreading beneath her skin. She couldn't let herself look at it. Not now. Ahead of her, Captain Morales moved with grim determination, his shoulders hunched against the low ceiling. The glow of his handheld torch reflected off the sweat on his neck. In his other hand, he gripped the pulse detonator, a last resort. A weapon not designed to kill, but to obliterate everything in its radius, including them. "Are you sure this will work?" Shaw whispered, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound calm. Morales didn't turn around. "It has to." Behind them, the distant sound of scraping metal echoed through the ship's ventilation system. A low, rhythmic thudding followed, a sound like something enormous crawling through the walls. Shaw clenched her fists, willing herself not to panic. The thing hunting them wasn't Ishra anymore. Not entirely. It had become something else, something grotesque and far more human than she could bear to admit. They reached the access panel to the engine core. Morales knelt and began to unseal it, his movements steady despite the tremor in his hands. Shaw kept watch, her eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. She could feel it, feel Ishra, its presence pressing against her mind like a suffocating weight. It whispered to her, its voice both tender and mocking. "You don't have to fight, Aaron. You're already part of me. Let me finish what we started." She gritted her teeth, pressing her knuckles to her temple, as if she could physically force the voice out. "Shut up," she hissed under her breath. Morales glanced back at her. "You okay?" "Yeah," she lied. The panel slid open with a hiss of depressurized air, revealing the glowing core of the ship's reactor. The throbbing pulse of energy felt alive, and for a moment Shaw wondered if the Endeavor itself had begun to succumb to Ishra's influence. Morales crawled inside, gesturing for her to follow. "We rig this thing to overload," he said, his voice steady but grim. "We make sure Ishra can't reach Earth." "And us?" Shaw asked, though she already knew the answer. Morales didn't reply. He didn't have to. As they worked, the sound of Ishra's approach grew louder. The scraping and thudding were no longer distant. They were all around them, echoing through the walls and floor. Shaw's hands trembled as she rewired the core's fail-safes, each movement precise but painfully slow. "Almost there," Morales muttered. "Keep going." The whispers in Shaw's mind intensified, growing sweeter, more insistent. Ishra's voice filled her head, weaving through her memories, her fears, her desires. "Why destroy what we could become? You feel it already, don't you? The strength, the unity. I can take your pain away, Aaron. I can make you perfect." Her hands faltered. For a split second, she considered it. The pain in her side was unbearable, the infection spreading through her veins like fire. She could feel the alien cells rewriting her, reshaping her. It would be so easy to stop fighting, to let it take her. Morales's voice snapped her back. "Shaw, stay with me." She blinked, shaking her head violently. "I'm fine," she said, her voice hoarse. She wasn't, but there was no time for hesitation. Suddenly, the metal grating above them tore open with a deafening screech. Shaw screamed as Ishra dropped into the narrow crawl space, its elongated limbs folding unnaturally as it landed. Its face, now so close to human it was horrifying, twisted into a mockery of a smile. Its eyes, black and fathomless, locked onto hers. "Why resist?" it said, its voice dripping with false kindness. "You can't win." Morales lunged, raising his weapon, but Ishra moved faster than either of them could react. A tendril shot out from its arm, slamming into Morales's chest and pinning him to the wall. The detonator clattered to the floor, just out of reach. "Elias!" Shaw screamed. Morales grunted in pain, his face pale but defiant. "Shaw, finish it. Don't let it win." Ishra's head tilted, its smile widening. "Why do you fight for a species so broken, so flawed? You could be so much more." Shaw scrambled for the detonator, her fingers closing around the cold metal. Ishra saw her move and lashed out, another tendril striking her side. Pain exploded through her, and she cried out, the weapon slipping from her grasp. "You belong to me now," Ishra whispered, its tendrils tightening around both of them. But then Morales laughed, a wet, broken sound that caught both Shaw and Ishra off guard. Blood dripped from his mouth as he grinned up at the creature. "You talk too much." With the last of his strength, he jammed a knife into the tendril holding him. Ishra recoiled, its grip loosening just enough for Shaw to lunge forward, grabbing the detonator. She slammed her hand down on the activation switch, the core's hum escalating into a deafening roar. Ishra's face twisted in rage. "No!" Shaw shoved Morales free, ignoring the searing pain in her side as she pulled him toward the exit. The crawl space trembled as the reactor began to overload, the ship's structure groaning in protest. "Go!" Morales shouted, pushing her toward the escape pod hatch. "You can still make it." "I'm not leaving you!" Shaw yelled, but Morales shoved her harder. "Don't make this pointless," he roared. Tears streamed down her face as she crawled into the pod. Morales turned back toward the reactor, knife in hand, facing Ishra's advancing form. The last thing Shaw saw before the pod's hatch sealed was the flash of light as the core detonated, swallowing the crawl space in a blinding inferno. The escape pod shuddered violently as it was ejected into space. Through the viewport, Shaw watched as the Endeavor erupted in a brilliant, silent explosion. The shockwave rippled through the void, and for a moment, everything was still. Shaw slumped against the wall of the pod, her body racked with pain and grief. She stared at her hands, at the faint, unnatural lines spreading beneath her skin. Ishra was gone, but its mark remained. She reached for the pod's distress beacon, activating it with trembling fingers. As the signal pulsed into the emptiness, she leaned back and closed her eyes. "I stopped it," she whispered to herself, her voice hollow. "We stopped it." But in the silence of the pod, she felt it. A faint whisper at the edge of her mind. A quiet, persistent voice. "This isn't the end." And beneath her skin, something moved.